to That Business Show 2.0 with Jamie Maloney, where business becomes show business. On today's program, I want to talk about the idea of faith. A lot of people have been talking about, with recent storms and, these major natural disasters in the news, this whole idea that, the end of time is just near. And every time there's some big disaster, that community always speaks up and is talking about the book of Revelations and how it predicts that near the second coming of Christ, that there will be events of epic proportions, and so it happens every time there is a series of tragedies. But I'm not so much here to talk about that as much as I just want to talk about the idea of what faith is and the afterlife and all that stuff, because it's something that I spend a great deal of time thinking about. I'm a natural question asker, not only in business but also in life. It's something I was, even as a child, I was always asked questions. I'm somebody who values knowledge. My favorite quote, knowledge is power, because whatever it is that you know that I do not know, or whatever it is that you can do that I cannot do, gives you that much more power and ability over me to differentiate yourself from what it is that I do, or whatever it is that I'm trying to compete with you at. So never underestimate the power of knowledge and the power of skill. So spend your life being a great learner, being a great question asker, and never accepting that you are as you are. Always strive to become better than what it is that you are. Knowledge is power. Again, one of my favorite, my favorite line. So as a child, I asked a lot of questions. I always loved to ask questions around science and astronomy and religion. And as a child, I talked myself out of the belief in God 100%. I always claimed I was an atheist up until probably 10 years or so ago. And it was actually science that brought me back into the belief in of higher forms of existence and of God. And so the problem I always had, and I still have a lot of problems with traditional religion. So religion was, implemented, or I wouldn't say implemented. Religion, came about because it needed a way to control. It came around, in my opinion, for two reasons. First and foremost, we needed a way to control the masses, and so religion acts as a primary source of law. And without religion, without a belief that there is something of higher form or higher form of existence that knows what it is that you have done in all areas of your life, people would misbehave and behave in manners that would simply destroy society. Murders, thefts, rapes would be much more prevalent if people knew that, without a doubt, that there was no God in the sky that could then punish them for all of eternity. And so that is, the fact you can implement all the law that you want, but religion is again the primary source of law, and it has kept the masses in order ever since, again, the beginning of time. But it's also, secondly, has provided an answer for the unknown. See, man has always had a problem with the words, I don't know. And so they seek to answer the questions by implementing, God into the equation. That is because God intended it to do. That was God's will. And so that's why, religion came to the forefront in our society. That also coupled with my belief that we were visited by, powerful beings and aliens early in our society. And of course, those would be naturally viewed upon as gods. And that narrative was made popular by Eric von Daniken in his famous book, Chariots of the Gods, of which I read as a young child, and really began to make me think about religion and the institution that it is. And so, as a child or a teenager, I, became a staunch, atheist. I didn't believe in anything other than what could be seen and what could be proven. But it wasn't until, I started to delve more into quantum theory and physics that I then began to think that, that's not really true. And so, even today, as I do not accept a lot of the teachings that's in the Bible, I think a lot of that stuff was put there by man with an attempt deviate or to deceive, I should say, humanity. But I do believe in higher forms of existence, and I do believe that the ascension of all existence is a god or gods. I'm probably more polytheistic than I would be a monotheistic, in the sense that if something or an entity can ascend to a highest level, then other entities could too. And this is where I again came back to my belief in higher forms of existence. And so when somebody asks me, do I believe in God? I'm like, yes, but I'm not a Christian. I don't believe in the teachings of the Bible. Jesus Christ may have been God on earth. It may have been. I don't know. And nobody honestly knows that. I know Christians will say, yes, they do know that without a fact or without a disbelief. But if something is at its higher form of, if something is truly omnipotent, then it makes sense that they could then create, destroy, and inhabit other lives. And so Jesus Christ very well may have been, God on earth, as some people think, or was the Son of God. And his teachings, were put out to a man to better them. And so to a degree, I can say, yes, I understand, and believe in some of the Christian teachings, but a lot of what has been put out there has been manipulated by the church, and again, in an effort to deceive a lot of people and to make them fear that there is this afterlife of eternal punishment. And I've always said that it makes less sense than punishing an individual or a soul for all of eternity for the acts that they committed on this planet. It simply defies logic. There is no human being that has ever existed on this planet that has done acts so vile that it deserves an eternity in hell as described by the Bible. Yes, we've had many very, very evil individuals that have existed on this planet who deserve lots and lots of punishment, but to compare the 60 or 70 years they may or may not have existed on this planet to eternity is simply illogical. And it also it escapes the idea that people change over time. And so even the most evil people, had they been giving more time, let's say a person's life was extended from, instead of 70 years to 400 years. So at age 300, that person is not going to be who they were at age 40. So over enough time, people change, both for the good and for the bad. And so for that reason also, it makes no sense to me that people would be punished for an eternity for their acts committed in our three-dimensional space that we see as Earth. And so for that reason, I've always rejected the teachings of Christianity. It makes no sense to me why a soul would be punished throughout all of eternity for their acts, again, committed on this planet. I've often asked the questions, if first off, I always, have to ask, if you're a religious person, do you believe in reincarnation? Because if you do not, then, a child who dies at, infancy, or even before, they even become a 5 years old, at 6 years old, at what point do they truly become responsible for the acts that they commit on this planet? I mean, are you going to sentence a baby to all of eternity of suffering because they cried too much, because they didn't eat their food when served or something? It makes no sense. And so the only logical explanation of that is, well, then if they died too young, then they're reincarnated and they get to try again. Okay, well, that makes sense if that's what you truly believe. But if you don't believe in reincarnation and that all souls are given one opportunity at life, then to die at a young age should be an automatic ticket to heaven, because how can you hold something so young so responsible to suffer an eternity in hell for misbehavior? And so things like that I've always struggled with the teachings of Christianity because of that reasons. But it was actually, again, like I was saying earlier, the ideas around science that kind of brought me back to my belief in a higher form of existence. Because when you get into quantum theory and physics, you see that the universe is put together in a way that defies logic. You have, particles that behave as waves and behave as particles, and simply by the act of observation, it destroys the wave function and it makes it behave as a particle, whereas before it would be existing as a wave function. And so in essence, our reality governs, or our consciousness governs reality. And so what we see then breaks it down into reality. And so these ideas of, parallel universes and interdimensional beings out there, really made me stop and think that maybe there are higher forms of existence. It's foolish to think that the human being is the grandest creation that this universe has. Look how vast the universe is. It's unfathomably large. So why is it so large and yet we are such a small, tiny component of it? There are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on the beaches of all the entire planet Earth. And so why is it then that the human being is the grand creation? It's just simply illogical to me. And so there are higher forms of existence that achieve different levels of power and abilities as they ascend the ladder, and at the top of the ladder is then God, and then God is an omnipotent, all-knowing, and I don't even like to refer to it as an individual. It to me is just an energy, and I believe in reality, it's somehow the connection of all of us together. Our souls are all interconnected in a way that the human brain cannot understand, and we can never understand no matter how hard we try. It's as if you're trying to teach calculus to a dog. No matter how hard you try to teach calculus to a dog, it just can't learn it. So it's the same correlation with the idea of existence and interdimensional beings and higher forms of existence that we as humans cannot learn. And so that also, again, contributed to this newfound, I wouldn't say newfound, I've been spiritual for the last 10 years or so, and again, believing in higher forms of existence. But again, I do not believe that anything that you do here on this earth condemns you to an eternity in hell. I do believe in evil entities, and I do believe in evil forms of existence out there that do seek to do harm to individuals and to humans, and whether or not they are demons or agents of the devil, that's debatable too. And we'll talk about that here a little bit more when we come back from the break. You're currently listening to That Business Show 2.0. I'm your host, Jamie Maloney, where business becomes show business. Welcome back to That Business Show 2.0 with Jamie Maloney, where business becomes a show business. Today's business is the idea of faith. I like to talk about different areas of life and philosophy that interest me whenever I get some breaks from the guests on the program. And today, show kind of inspired by some of the disasters that have occurred recently in our area and stuff. And this idea that we're there in the times, and the Book of Revelations that talks about how everything is going to end in a series of disasters up into the second coming of Christ, and then people are going to ascend to heaven, and then those who did not meet the guidelines of getting into heaven will be left here on earth and under rule of the devil. Interesting stuff, but not something that I really believe in. But as I began to study physics and quantum theory more and more, again, the rules of what happens in the very small realm, which is quantum theory, do not line up with the rules of the large, and what we see around it, and that is the laws of relativity, which govern the movement of objects in a massive or in a grand space. And so you start to look into what's going on, and it's so difficult to understand that it almost makes you question whether or not we're even real, and what is consciousness, and are there other things out there that are dictating our behavior, and is there even free will amongst all of us? And so we're here in a three-dimensional space. There's three spatial dimensions, and there's one temporal dimension, that is the time dimension. So we're, in a four-dimensional space, so you got length, width, depth, and then you've got your time dimension. So first off, what is a dimension? I talk about the beings and entities that can exist across multiple dimensions, and I believe that what God is. God exists at the highest dimension across all dimensions. And when you exist across all dimensions, that means you can appear at any time, place, or a possibility. And so a dimension defined is a place in space-time that can be pinpointed. It has a coordinate system. If you recall from mathematics, your XY graphs, and you had a 3 and a -4, or 3 and 4, whatnot. And of course, it was hard to do the Z dimension right there, which added the depth, but you could draw the depth on the board, although it's being reflected in two-dimensional space. And so that is what a dimension, first and foremost, is. It's a point in space-time that can be pinpointed. Also, what is implied by a dimension is a place in which two objects can meet one another through some type of a path. In a three-dimensional space, I can travel to any other three-dimensional space via a straight line. I can get to it. But as you ascend to higher levels, there are no paths that exist to get to those levels, at least for a three-dimensional object such as ourselves. And so to visualize the dimensions, and it's kind of hard to explain, but there are excellent videos on YouTube that explain as believed, the 11 dimensions as predicted by string theory, which is one of the leading theories of the alternate dimensions in our universe. And you begin with a point, and a point is of indeterminate size. It has no length, width, or depth. It's just a point somewhere in space-time. And then when you pick a second point and you draw a line between the two, you've now entered the first dimension. The first dimension is strictly a straight line. It's determined strictly by length, and it's a spatial dimension of which you can move backwards or forwards along. And then when you branch off of the second dimension, now you have a length and a height, and now you have a second dimension. And then when you add the depth to it, you add the third dimension. But you can begin to understand how higher levels would perceive one another if you think of like a two-dimensional being as something that is think of a card, a king on a playing card. That is a two-dimensional creation, for instance. Imagine it is infinitely it has no depth to it. Let's think it is just it has length and height. If, for instance, if it couldn't have a digestive system because it wouldn't have a mouth, because that would then cut the card or the individual in two, and so the two-dimensional being would not be able to exist in 3 dimensions. It could have absolutely no types of depth whatsoever. And so if an object of 3 dimensions were to pass through the second two-dimensional beings, like a balloon, for instance, it would strictly, to them as they were observing it, begin as a dot and then expand into a big circle and then back down and pop in and out of existence. And so maybe these particles, or maybe this stuff that happens in quantum theory, whereas particles can appear from here and tunnel through walls, become entangled, where one particle influences the actions of the other particle at faster than the speeds of lights. Maybe this is in essence what is happening, through higher dimensions, and that's how we're perceiving it because we exist in a 3-dimensional space. Sort of like the example, what I'm talking about, a 2-dimensional creature that exists and sees something that is 3-dimensional passing through their 2-dimensional space. They cannot perceive the dimension of depth, so they strictly see a dot and then a big circle, and then when it goes away, just a dot, and then it fades into nothing. You could also think of entering a higher dimension, sort of like somebody on a television set. And when you watch a TV is a 2-dimensional representation of a 3-dimensional things of people on there. And so if you were watching a TV set and somebody is standing in a road and a car is speeding at them, and if they were to enter a higher dimension, the car could no longer hit them because they're not in the exact coordinates to be impacted. And so what if the person in the road were able to step outside of the television set? They would be entering the higher dimension. They would be leaving a 2-dimensional space and coming into the 3-dimensional space, and then the car could no longer hit them. They have stepped through the television set. They've went from a 2-dimensional space into a 3-dimensional space. And so through those examples there, you can kind of begin to understand how, as you ascend to higher levels, how levels that are underneath of them perceive. And it's predicted by string theory, which is the idea that governs all of reality. And it's a very, very, very complicated theory, that tiny, infinitely tiny little strings dictate and form all the subatomic particles, and then go on to form, of course, all the mass that exists in the universe. But as you go up and up and up into the dimensions, you achieve the ability to travel a long time. You begin to achieve the ability to have alternate realities, ultimate forms of existence that existed, from the Big Bang out. You have different initial conditions that existed from the Big Bang, and then you treat all of those as points within space-time, and then you can begin to travel between wherever it is that you are here in space and in time, and then travel to alternate realities that are not dependent upon the space or the time. And so it creates a lot of paradoxes. Everyone's familiar with the grandfather paradox. What would happen if you went back in time and killed your grandfather? How would you exist? And how would you even be there in the first place? If you had went back in time and killed your grandfather, you wouldn't exist. And so this creates the only solution to that is that all possible realities exist and that there are alternate timelines. So if you were to go back in the time and kill your grandfather, for the moment that you do that, a new timeline is automatically created. But meanwhile, the timeline where you didn't go back into in time to kill your grandfather still proceeds forward. And so there's this parallel universe, there's this all realities theory that is out there, that all realities do exist in one form, or I would say not necessarily one form or another, but all realities do exist. The idea of the infinite universe, because the subatomic particles can only be arranged in so many different ways before they have to start repeating across one another. And so the universe at some point, if it is infinite, must begin to repeat. Is the universe truly infinite? Is there boundaries? But we do know that the universe is expanding. And what is it expanding into? On top of that, is expanding at an accelerating rate, which is mystifying physicists. How is something that is expanding, gaining energy, and continuing to expand at an accelerating rate? And this is where dark energy and dark matter come into play. And those are things we can't even see, but we know that they're there. We know that dark energy is there because, again, the expansion of the universe can only be explained with the introduction of dark energy. Dark matter we know exists because of the way galaxies behave, and they should fly apart, but dark matter is holding them together. So we know that it exists because of the gravitational influence that it has on its surrounding bodies. And so that makes you think there's things out there that we only know are there because of what we're seeing, how they behave on their environment. Is this somehow tied to these higher dimensions that we cannot interact with? And so getting back to the original premise of this discussion, the idea of faith is centered around the idea that we're only in a three-dimensional space. These higher beings, this paranormal activity that we see, all these entities and spirits, I believe in all that stuff. They exist across these higher dimensions, and for some reason, sometimes these dimensions break down and they can appear in our dimensions, whereas normally we can't see them. And at the highest level of existence is a God, and a God is omnipotent, and it's a creator, and it's a destroyer of life. And so yes, I mean, God could sentence people to an eternity of hell if God wanted to. It's simply, to me though, it's not logical that anything that we do on this planet, even if we don't believe in a God, is logical enough to go to hell for all of eternity. And so these are just different things, that, I like to think about. The world is a very fascinating place. I believe there's just, so much out there that we don't understand. I believe we probably don't even understand 1% of what goes on in this universe and our place in this entire universe. It's an amazing thing that is, the human being, but yet we are so weak and so frail and so ignorant of what is truly out there and why we are really here. So one of my great, loves, again, to think about the unknown. And again, knowledge is power, one of my favorite quotes, but yet I am so ignorant on this subject, as is most of man. And even the most intelligent of us cannot, even begin to explain the universe. And then the ultimate, catch-22 is, the universe has an interesting number of just, points of, where you get to a certain level, the universe turns on you. It's like, you can get so intelligent, but once you get so intelligent, you become insane. And it's unfortunate that we'll never be able to understand the universe because there's an insanity level that seems to protect the universe from us knowing much more. But there's all kinds of interesting things like that. Whereas if you could once you get to a certain point, like a singularity, things no longer make sense. Things break down, or the energy levels become too great to where it doesn't make sense that that it can be seen or something like that. So I got to wrap up this program. Again, catch new episodes each weekday morning, 9 a.m., thatbusinessnetwork.com. We're always looking for content for the program. Visit tbsinterview.com for more information. I'll talk to you soon.